And let's go ahead and jump into things. There's a big spooky new vulnerability out there, right? Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Oh man. Okay, no. This one's called Ghost, and there's actually a good reason for it. Turns out that the vulnerable code here is actually the get host by name and get host by name 2 functions in Glibc. Glibc is a library that's used heavily in Linux. Pretty much every machine out there running Linux or some other Unix variants is going to be running Glibc. Now the problem with this function here is we've got a call, and it's got a little bit of a complicated name. I'm not going to read the underscores. NSS hostname digits dots function used by get host by name, and it turns out that you can actually do a buffer overflow against this function. And the Qualys, who reported the bug, is saying that this has the ability to perform code execution if you can properly overwrite this bit of code. You only get, depending on the platform, 4 or 8 bytes worth of space that you can write into, which is not a lot, but apparently they've got proof of concept code against the XM email server showing that this is actually possible.
Right.
Now, there's been a lot said about this bug in the last day or so, and as of taping, we're still trying to figure out exactly how critical this is. I recommend that everybody be patching this. It's going to be a little bit difficult because it's so widely used. Basically, you're going to have to patch and then restart every process that uses Glibc. And at that point, you may as well reboot your whole box to make sure you've covered everything, because it is, like I said, so heavily used. Qualys has actually put out a list of software that they've looked at to say that these are not vulnerable, which is probably going to be a good list to start working on it as well.
It's a big help. It was some of the very more popular things that you would.
Yeah, I think Nginx, Apache, OpenSSH are not vulnerable. The thing about this bug is that it's not something you can really externally scan for until you've identified how it's used in each piece of software and whether or not it's actually vulnerable. Now, once you've identified something like that XM email server, you can write a tool to scan the network for that. But it's going to be a long slog figuring out who's vulnerable, who's not.
Well, and the wide variety of cases that might exist, right? So this has a lot of similarities to the shell shock vulnerability in that, the vulnerability was kind of buried in bash. It was a little bit esoteric in how you could, get bash to exhibit that vulnerability. But then the question is, when does bash get used? Well, it gets used in all kinds of sort of scripting activities in the background. This isn't a case where it's scripting, but it certainly is a case like. Now, explain a little bit. We haven't talked about buffer vulnerabilities or buffer overflow vulnerabilities for a while, and that's a very generic thing that's kind of buried in, oftentimes associated with C code. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So in most programming languages, I think pretty much in any situation where you've got a processor and memory that needs to be allocated, when you define a variable in code, it allocates a certain amount of space for it. So if I say that I want to have a string and I want to have 5 characters, it'll give me whatever the representation for 5 characters is going to be in memory. There are functions which will operate on that allocated space. Some of the older ones, like strcpy, string copy, which is actually one of the functions that's being called in this case, do not check that the space you're writing to is the same as the length of what you're writing to it. And what will happen is, if I've got a space that's 4 bytes long and I'm trying to write something that's 6 bytes into it, it'll keep writing beyond the end of where I'm supposed to be writing. And that's called a buffer overflow. And what'll happen is whatever you write into may be some other important part of memory. Maybe it'll give you the ability to overwrite the stack pointer and control the flow of code, which is a common case when you have buffer overflows. So it's one of the classic vulnerability types. If anybody's really interested in it and wants to get a little bit down in the weeds, smashing the stack for fun and profit is an old write-up by Aleph1 in Frack. I don't remember what issue it is, but if you Google for it, you'll find it. And that was like my first introduction to those, and it was a pretty good one.
Mine too, actually.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so this has been around for a very long time, and I think this kind of points out sort of that balance between code efficiency and code, I guess, resiliency. I'll use the term resiliency. And that, there was a programming language you may have heard of called ADA, ADA, that had strict typing associated with it. That is basically it bound you to you had to declare the size and the type of every variable, and there was checking for each time a function was called associated with those variables to specifically avoid buffer overflows, whereas C doesn't have those controls. It depends on the programmer to put those checks into place and protect against those. And so I think, I'm actually a little bit surprised that buffer overflow vulnerabilities on one hand still exist, or that we've had such a long, what I feel to be somewhat of a hiatus, that we haven't seen that many of them recently, or at least not buried in the C libraries. But this is a case where obviously they're coming to the surface again. And I think it's yet another example where we're going to see more and more of these vulnerabilities that are widespread across many different operating systems, applications, and things like that that are dependent on similar code.
Yeah, and this is one of those cases like we talked about with the bash, that it kind of got, the vulnerability was introduced in there, and it sat there for a long time. The vulnerability actually has been there since November of 2000 and was fixed in May of 2013. But at the time, they didn't realize that it was potentially remotely exploitable, so they didn't make a big deal out of backpatching all of the versions of Linux that are on long-term support. So there are, some of the newer versions are not vulnerable to this because they're running the newer patched version, and it's now that all of the Linux distributions are backporting this patch and releasing patches for some of their older versions that are still under support. So it's one of those that slipped by for quite a while.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's another example like that. Now, it is encouraging. I wasn't aware of this before, that the newer versions are not susceptible. But
well, there's something I do want to say about that, is that sometimes you'll have code that there's a difference between dynamic compilation and static compilation. Now, if you've got code that's using glibc dynamically, it means it's going to reach out and grab whatever version's available on the system, and that means if you replace it on the system, you've fixed it across all the code that loads it dynamically. If you've got it statically compiled into the code you're using, you're going to have to recompile the whole thing to replace the bad code.
Right.
And identifying that's going to be a little bit of a trick. And I did want to say, Jim reminded me, you started talking about it being remotely exploitable. It is locally exploitable. That is, they do have proof of concept code that shows that you can overwrite this in the function locally. So if there's a way you can use it to, exploit something locally, if you're on the machine and you're able to feed a domain name that fits the characteristics to a local machine, a local application, you might be able to gain control of it and operate at its
you could use it
as its process.
Privilege escalation attack?
Thank you, yeah. I was trying to say that, but it's a very roundabout way of doing it. Yeah.
All right, well, good. Well, thank you for bringing that.